not all cones are from pines. A lot of times when people are talking about cones, they're calling them pine cones, maybe around the holidays when they're in wreaths, things like that, and you hear them called pine cones, but in fact, many cones are not actually from pines. The biggest mistake most people make when talking about cones is that they call them pine cones. All plants that are known as conifers are cone-bearing plants. So those plants typically have needled evergreen leaves, or at least needled leaves, and you will find cones on those, but cones come in all shapes and sizes, just like the trees do that bear the cones. So as you can see behind me, there are a lot of different plants here in a lot of different shapes and colors, and they're mostly coniferous plants or cone-bearing plants. Cones can come in many sizes. The longest cone can be up to 2 feet long, and at least the largest cone in North America is 2 feet long. And then there's a heavy cone called the coulter pine. That's the biggest cone. That could be up to 16 inches long and weigh up to 11 pounds. And you can compare that with some of the smallest cones. Hemlock cones that we have in our own woods are very tiny, and then things like what look like blueberries on eastern red cedars are actually cones where all the parts are fused together and are blue in color and the size of a pea. So I will show you the types of cones that you might find in the Ambler Arboretum. So I'll start with our pine cones. So these are actually pine cones, and we have a couple of different kinds here. And some people divide pines into hard pines and soft pines, and the needles are soft on soft pines, and the cones tend to be soft and flexible too on soft pine. And then on hard pines like Virginia pine or red pine, you have stiff cones, and they can have little prickles on them here, which make them sharp also. So cones generally are made up of scales. So each of these are scales on here, and depending on the cone, they look a little different, but basically this is the reproductive part, and so this is where the seeds are. Conifers get cones, but they don't get flowers, and so this is how they have male and female cones. So here we have pine cones, various kinds of pine cones. To demonstrate the difference between a male and a female cone, we have the cedar cones. So this is from Atlas cedar, and so this is the male cone. So this has the pollen on it. These are wind pollinated, so they don't need to be showy or to attract bees or anything like that. So, so they just let the pollen go in the wind, and then the female cone starts out smaller than this, but as it matures, this is where the seeds are. So this is the female cone of a cedar. So this is not a pine cone, it's a cedar cone. And since the goal of cones is to reproduce the plant, what happens is on the cedar cone, these scales eventually separate and come off of the cone and then disperse around. So there's a seed in here in these scales, and so these will eventually disperse and will either feed animals or grow new plants. In our pine cones, there's two kinds of scales. There's the scale with the seeds on it, and then there's a protective outer scale. And so these protective outer scales stay on the cone while the seed scales distribute either through animals or wind. Some other types of cones that we have spruce cones. So spruce cones, different shape than pine cones. This is closed, so it's protecting its seeds, and it won't release these or open up until the conditions are just right. For some cones, that means it has to go through a fire. For other cones, it just has to be a couple years old. It might have to warm up and be hot. So it depends on the cone. But this is a Norway spruce cone that is closed. And then I have very tiny cones. So they kind of look like miniature white pine cones, but they are hemlock cones. And hemlocks are native to our woodlands, and just one of the ID characteristics is that they have these teeny tiny little cones on them. And then some cones, like this cryptomeria cone, comes from a very large tree, but it's a small cone. It's spiky, and the different scales are fused on here, which makes it look like a ball instead of like a long cone like you're used to thinking of a cone. So that just goes to show you all the variety of cones that are out there. And we have cryptomeria cones and cedar cones and spruce cones and Japanese umbrella pine cones, and then regular pine cones. So this, speaking of cone fusion, is often mistaken for a cone. And so what you'll see here, this is a cedar branch. This is a deodar cedar branch, and it has long needles, and this thing here, what looks like a cone here, could be mistaken for a cone on the plant because it's made up of the plant parts. But actually, the cedar cone is that big round cone, and this is a bagworm larva. And so what this does is this insect actually takes pieces of plant and builds a cocoon around itself so it blends in and looks like part of the plant, but is actually not part of the plant. It hangs this bag from a piece of silk that it makes around the twig and then pulls little pieces of the plant off, surrounds itself with it. So oftentimes land care managers and students mistake these for cones. It is important to remember that not only are cones the reproductive part of the plant, of coniferous plants, they're also an important food source for wildlife. So the greater diversity of plants you have in your landscape that bear cones, the greater diversity of animals you will support there. So the Ambler Arboretum is open 7 days a week from sunrise to sunset, and you can come and explore our conifer garden and the many conifers that are around the 187 acres of our landscape.